In Genesis 1, the author, who was most likely Moses, describes the creation of Adam's garden. In his original state, Adam was healthy and obedient to God. His pristine garden provided him all of his needs. But in Genesis 2:17, God is seen giving Adam directions on what not to eat. Those directions were clearly not followed. For when God asked Adam what he had done, he blamed his actions on the woman that God had given him. When God asked Eve about what she had done, she blamed her actions on the serpent. The serpent, of course, didn't have a leg to stand on. Adam and his kin were immediately banished from the bounty of the garden. As with the Genesis account of humanity's early existence, our flawed state, which results from selfish choices and actions, has plagued us ever since. This episode in Abrahamic cosmology, or the beginning of the world, established beliefs in God's practice of geotheological. God uses nature to punish, and geotheomisthosis. God uses nature to reward. With the Great Flood, God's use of applying punishments from nature is fairly obvious, but we have to look a bit deeper to find examples of geotheomisthosis. In the book of Leviticus, we find Moses explaining God's method of rewarding people for their obedience, and in doing so, he rather ingeniously shows a method of modern agricultural science that's used to ensure that soil can be rejuvenated and thus be used in a sustainable way to support life. And I quote, "Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety. You may ask, what will we eat the seventh year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest of the 9th year comes in." End of quote. This week on The Vantage Point, we're going to compare the idea of religious geography to the geography of religions. You might be thinking, Van, you're delusional. Who cares about the difference between them? Hang on there for a few minutes, and you'll see that one of those ideas shapes our lives in many ways, and the other is the result of that shaping. Let's first delve into a basic contrast of them. Geography of religions asks where and why questions of particular religious expressions. For example, where do we find Islamic mosques? That's a where question. And why are they located in those places? That's a why question. On the other hand, religious geography gets into how religious thinking and beliefs impact the cultural and natural landscapes. To help us explore religious geography today on The Vantage Point, I want to explore some concepts that were first coined by the geographer John K. Wright back in the 1940s. We call those concepts geotheology. I hope you'll join me. For those of you who recognize the theo in geotheology, you might be interested in knowing that a religion does not have to involve divine beings, as in theo, to be a religion. In my books, I rely on an interdisciplinary definition that I think is handy and practical. A religion is a set of beliefs that explains reality and offers a prescription for optimizing life. It may or may not involve the supernatural or the hereafter. But to be a social institution, the beliefs have to be shared and practiced by others. Because we're talking about beliefs, we're not talking about facts or physical laws of nature. There is an element of faith involved in a religion. Faith, of course, is reliance on trust, belief, or confidence in a person, being, or set of ideas when there is limited empirical evidence. In Hebrews 11:1, we find that faith is defined more succinctly as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, you might be thinking that the Marxist ideas that permeate politics and religious discourse in the modern world don't rely on the supernatural, so how do we account for them? Stay tuned. We actually have some related concepts to capture the essence of non-supernatural belief systems, such as those practiced by the Khmer Rouge, Antifa, and BLM. Most of the geotheological terms and concepts found in the geographic literature were coined by J.K. Wright back in the 1940s to identify the synthesis of religious and environmental geographies. Specifically, geotheological terms include geotheology, which is the general relationship between space and the worship of God or gods. Geopiety, the emotional aspects of religion tied to space. Geoteleology, the role of space in the unfolding of God's providence or destiny. And geoeschatology, the role of space in the outcomes of providence or end times scenarios like the Battle of Armageddon. These concepts are all significant in understanding religious imagery associated with spaces, including towns, villages, and nations, as well as the forces of nature. Wright's approach and his useful vocabulary call upon us to consider such interior imagings in geographical thinking because of the role that imagings, feelings, and thoughts have in molding human environmental perceptions and behaviors, which often impact the landscape with visible patterns and structures, which we're going to see in a few minutes. Geotheology, as conceived by Wright, failed to capture the full range of the ways in which people associate the forces of nature with the divine. So I introduced new terminology into the discipline back in 2011 and 12, geotheocalasis and geotheomisthosis, which we've already introduced. The new terms capture the belief that the forces of nature are used by deities to punish or reward individuals, towns, and nations. I further modified those new terms to identify ways in which people who exclude God from human environmental relationships maintain that there are nonetheless negative consequences for living environmentally exploitive lifestyles and positive gains for living in harmony with nature. Geocalasis is the belief that nature punishes humans for not living in harmony with it. Geomisthosis, on the other hand, occurs when nature seemingly rewards us for living sustainable lifestyles. Geomisthosis is the goal of followers of the Green Movement. Geotheological imagings often lead people to modify the cultural landscape, migrate, or even vote for a particular party. When religious people build houses of worship, graveyards, or designate other spaces for religious purposes, they use their creative impulses to build structures that reflect deeper values and religious imagery of the hereafter or other important doctrines. The same holds true for totem poles among Native Americans. In doing these things, people show that a religion is a social activity which lends itself to mapping, which gets geographers excited. An example, the geography of religion can be seen in maps of Islam, Roman Catholicism, or American Protestantism. I have found that geotheology is useful when applied to studies on biblical and Quranic topics and themes. In my soon-to-be released book titled Climate Change in History, A Geotheological Perspective, I used ancient pagan, biblical, and Quranic narratives and environmental understandings of the time period to better appreciate the kinds of weather and climatic conditions that prevailed in Europe and across the Abrahamic lands for more than 10 centuries. Incidentally, I was able to compare biblical narratives featuring weather events to paleoclimate studies, and in doing so, I was able to add to the discussion on dating the age of biblical texts. Well, I hope this brief excursion into the essential differences between religious geography and the geography of religions was helpful. If it was, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you next time here again on The Vantage Point.